Well, good morning, Dr. Seyfried. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to
Yeah,
be
it's a
here.
pleasure. Yeah, I'll just preface this with I was actually in touch with Dr. Seyfried when I was starting my projects in my master's degree. And so I did that in the ketogenic diet and I looked at how it affected obesity and breast cancer. Specifically, my lab worked with breast cancer cells. And that was my project. So I initially reached out to Dr. Seyfried and he was very helpful in pointing me in the right direction. It is definitely a newer line of research and it's being more carefully looked at. So I know that you're at the forefront and you have a lab that's looking at that now. But most importantly, what's your background with education, your lab, and how did you get started with cancer, which eventually led you to look at the ketogenic diet as an adjuvant therapy?
Yeah, well, we've been working on cancer for decades, but more in line with just lipid biochemistry. But we had also had a very active program in keto for epilepsy. So we had managed epileptic seizures in animal models using keto, which is where ketogenic diets have been mostly used, is in managing epileptic seizures. So we had learned that the management of epileptic seizures was based on reduced glucose and elevated ketones, and the cancer cells are glucose dependent. So you know that they have damaged oxidative phosphorylation, which would then restrict their ability to respire fuels. So it became a very easy transition going from epilepsy to cancer. We still don't know the mechanism by which ketogenic diet stops epileptic seizures. There's a lot of interesting concepts, but it's still far from clear. Whereas in cancer, it's very clear. I mean, cells that are dependent on fermentable fuels. Glucose is the prime source of a fermentable fuel, and therefore you take away glucose, and you have a good chance of restricting the growth of the tumor cells.
Right. And so what was the history behind, the ketogenic diet? I know that initially in the 1920s, I believe it was used to treat epilepsy, and then it was transitioned over as, a dietary method, mostly because of the diet and how it's primitive in nature, according to, what we would have eaten a very long time ago. But what was the origin of that, and how did that
Well,
get involved with epilepsy?
yeah, it started with fasting by itself. So Wilder at Mayo Clinic back in the 1920s found that if children or even adults that were continuing to have chronic seizures, stopped eating, drank water only, their seizures would be dissipated. But of course, that's not a long-term. They were doing water-only therapeutic fasting. So I mean, you can only do that for so long.
Right.
So they watched the changes, and what they found was blood sugar went down and ketones went up. So they felt that if you took a fat diet with no carbohydrates, very little carbohydrates, you could replicate the physiological conditions of water-only fasting. And then this became probably the most powerful method for managing epileptic seizures, even to this day. The ketogenic diet is primarily used and accepted for managing epileptic seizures. It's not accepted or understood yet for managing cancer. Although it should be obvious to anyone that knows the metabolism of cancer, it should be obvious why it works.
Right. And, taking back to the metabolic origin of cancer, the shift towards glucose, the Warburg effect, and when we initially saw cases of cancer many thousands of years ago.
Well, I mean, it was Warburg who first identified cancer as a deficiency of oxidative phosphorylation, and we have proved he is right. His theory was in fact correct. Cancer cells use glucose because they can't respire, so they have to ferment. But we also recently identified the Warburg Q effect, which is that they can ferment glutamine through glutaminolysis, mitochondrial substrate level phosphorylation. Warburg did not know about that, but we've now identified that as a key. So they will ferment amino acid and they will ferment lactic acid to generate energy in the absence of oxidative phosphorylation. So Warburg was essentially correct. He just didn't have all the parts to the puzzle.
Right. And, looking at it from a new age perspective, we've seen obesity rates, skyrocket over the last few decades. The consumption of sugar has never been higher, especially in its processed and refined form. And we see certain relationships with cancer. I mean, initial work done by Dahl and Pito, they found, I believe it was up to 25% of cancer patients were obese, and more recent research has suggested it's anywhere from 30 to 40% of patients with cancer that are obese. And with that obesity, you see comorbidities that are associated with a higher carbohydrate diet in the Western population. So you get things like insulin resistance that shows up consistently in cancer patients. You see type 2 diabetes that's been shown in up to 20% of patients. And so how do you explain that recent trend? Is it just going back to the Warburg effect and the general direction that our North American culture has taken with diet itself?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated situation. Sugar does not cause cancer. Sugar is not a carcinogen. I mean, now what happens in some people who are obese, if you look at their C-reactive protein, which is a marker for systemic inflammation, you find that to be elevated in many people who have type 2 diabetes. Not all, but many people. If you look at C-reactive protein is a marker for systemic inflammation. Systemic inflammation can damage mitochondria in certain cells of the body, thereby increasing the risk for a tumor. So it's inflammation, basically, that links it to cancer. Not necessarily the level of sugar, but levels of sugar that are persistently high produce systemic inflammation. Inflammation is known to damage respiration, which is the first step in the path to cancer. It's a two-step process. One is damaged respiration. Two is the ability of that cell to switch from oxphos to fermentation. If the cell can't switch to fermentation, it's not likely a tumor could ever form in the first place. So it's only the two pathways needed to generate cancer.
Right. And, some of the work our lab has done was very similar in that regard, where we looked at, mice. We looked at how the adipose profile or the fatty tissue affected the cancer. And we found that, a fattier adipose profile actually increased tumor growth, while a leaner adipose tissue environment reduce cancer growth. So that's interesting that there are markers outside of just the sugar profile or the carbohydrate intake itself. Now, jumping into the specifics of keto and cancer, going a little bit deeper into the mitochondrial dysfunction. So can you explain that shift in a little bit more specificity? I mean, the mitochondrial shift, is that just an inability of these specific cells to use the mitochondria or to upregulate the mitochondria? Where did that shift essentially come into play?
Well, if you look at cancer cells under the electron microscope, you just have to look at the number structure of the mitochondria. They're all damaged. So one of the tenets of biology is structure determines function. If the very structure of the organelle is abnormal, I mean, you automatically assume, knowing that organelle cannot function appropriately. So the question is, how is the cell surviving if its main source of energy is defective? They ferment. And that's why when you target glucose and glutamine, you kill them.
If you want to learn how to implement the ketogenic diet and the Press Pulse protocol into your cancer management, just visit school.com/keto for cancer, the new community by our research analyst Johnny Rockermeyer. Within this new community platform, you can connect with other patients and learn from their experiences. You can also just search through the posts other members have already made. You will have access to our classroom section as well, which provides practical advice and tools for the best results. These sections cover all parts of the Press Pulse protocol that you should implement. Starting with the general scientific concepts by Dr. Thomas Seyfried, we will show you how to start the ketogenic diet, including which foods to choose and which to avoid. Additionally, we prepared a list of doctors specialized in metabolic therapy, as well as details about glutamine inhibition and hyperbaric oxygen protocols. So, take a look around at school.com/keto for cancer.
Now, the fatty acids need good mitochondria to generate energy. So fatty acids cannot directly produce energy in tumor cells. What fatty acids do is they facilitate the uptake of glucose and glutamine indirectly. And many cancer cells will store triglycerides as droplets. That's because they can't respire the fatty acids, so they store them, because if they don't store them, the fatty acids will kill the tumor cells. So that's why they're stored as lipid droplets. But the lipid droplets are not driving the energy of the tumor cell. It's glucose and glutamine that's driving it. You take away glucose and glutamine, the tumor cells are history. They die.
Yeah, yeah. And so is your work currently in the lab, what models are you using in terms of animals? Have we taken this to human studies yet, or is it just in the novelty?
No, it's good. We vet everything first in the lab with glioblastoma and metastatic cancer systems. And then we work with physician groups around the world to implement these kinds of strategies in the clinic. So in Egypt and Turkey, in Hungary, and in the United States, we're starting to consider clinics that will treat cancer as a metabolic disease, all based on the concept that glucose and glutamine are the drivers of the disease. So you have to retrain physicians, and you have to restock. You have to do a lot of things differently than what we're currently doing.
Right, and I mean, at least from what I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of the most promising research has been glioblastoma, brain tumor specifically. Do you know if there's a reason why certain cancers may respond? Yeah.
We don't know any cancer that doesn't respond, okay? Because they all have the same disease. Every cancer is the same disease. They all have defective respiration. So if it's a blood cancer, they're going to be sucking down massive amounts of glutamine and glucose. If it's a breast cancer, colon cancer, bladder cancer, brain cancer, they're all the same. So, I mean, when you look at the mitochondria of any kind of a cancer, it's damaged under the electron microscope. So you look at breast, look at colon, look at liver, look at brain. They're all damaged mitochondria. They have to ferment. So cancer is one disease. It's a fermenting disease, and you can starve it to death by taking away the fermentable fuels, and it doesn't make any difference where it's located or what tissue or these kinds of things.
Right. And do you think there are limitations of it, for example, in things like lung cancer or cancers that maybe have an adequate oxygen supply, or maybe have adapted over time to using alternative fuel sources?
There are no other alternative fuel sources. You have to realize that in order to drive an inefficient system, you have to have an abundance of the fuel source. Okay? So cancer cells can metabolize other amino acids. The problem is they're so few and far between. There's not enough of them. Mm-hmm. And it requires energy to metabolize them for energy. Whereas glutamine is pure energy. It requires no metabolic management. So it goes right into the system. Yeah, so there are no other fuels abundant in the microenvironment that can drive the disease, except glucose and glutamine. So those are the two prime fuels. When they are deprived, I don't know of any cancer cell that can survive in the absence of those fuels.
Right, that's very interesting. And I know you mentioned briefly the research field within pets, animals specifically, dogs and cats. And I saw one of your presentations where you showed a dog that I believe it was a tumor on its snout. Yeah. And you put it on a ketogenic diet, and you monitored that tumor over time. And it basically disappeared over the course of however many months that you had this dog on a ketogenic diet. Now, I know we use the term ketogenic diet a lot, and in my opinion, it's unfortunate because I don't really think that it's a diet. I think it's a very natural way of eating that our bodies respond to, and we are most optimal in that regard. I know the counter argument for a lot of people is that, well, I can eat carbs and I don't die. So how do you explain that? Well, tolerance and health optimization is a hell of a lot more different than just being able to tolerate and digest something physically. Just because it doesn't kill you doesn't necessarily mean that it's right for your body. So, we see the same thing with pets and the way that we feed them. I mean, the pet industry has industrialized and mass-produced pet food the same way we feed ourselves in North America. I mean, if you look at Kibbles and Bits and you look at some of the biggest, pet products and what they're putting in their food, I mean, the reason it's cheap is because it's processed grains. And cats and dogs, if you look at their
listen, it's not only processed grains, it's processed recycling of dead dogs and cats as well. That's how the phenobarbital got into the Kibbles and Bits and the gravy train and those other things. So you euthanize animals in the shelters, and then the bodies are recycled back into the food. They've been pulling stuff off the market on that. And that dog that we put on metabolic therapy is still alive, is still doing well. So I think we're going to make major headway when we start to treat dogs with cancer. We should be able to really move fast on resolving cancer in dogs because they're a good source. We can manage that without harming them. You saw that from that one. More and more of these dogs are doing really well, because dogs did not evolve to eat grains and sugar and all the crap that the dog food companies are putting into these foods, and they're killing the dogs just as well as we're killing ourselves with these foods. So so once you go back to all natural foods, they all came from wolves. So wolves are primarily carnivores, and you give them natural foods related to their species, and many of the ailments disappear, and dogs live much, much longer. You can get them out 15 to 20 years on the appropriate food, when on the crap that they're giving them in most of these vet foods, these commercial dog foods are very unhealthy. And Rodney Habib from Canada has been a real proponent of natural foods for dogs, and he has a dog cancer series showing how all these poor dogs are dying and suffering from the types of foods, the inappropriate foods that we have been giving these animals.
Right. And I mean, you see the same thing with humans, and you see the same thing with cats and dogs. You end up developing certain issues that, could lead to cancer, for example, inflammation. But, we're putting humans on Celebrex for joint pain, when in reality their inflammation is a direct, cause and effect from their high carbohydrate diet. They're just having way too much bread and carbs in their diet, and basically by cutting that out, and I've seen it through people around me and people that we've talked to, where they're off medication within a week or two of switching to a more heavily carnivore based diet, maybe not even fully cutting out their carbohydrate sources, but just cutting out the refined carbs. And I think that you see the same thing with cats and dogs. I think the reason that their lives are a bit shorter than they should be, and the same thing, I see people putting their cats and dogs on so many different medications by the time they're 8, 9, 10 years old. And to me, it doesn't make sense. I mean, strictly speaking, from a biological or evolutionary standpoint, how would these dogs have survived and lasted so long if they needed to be on medication by the time that they were 8 years old? It just doesn't make sense to me.
No. Well, I mean, it doesn't make sense to most people who think about it. But, the dogs are getting sick. They are given medication just like humans, and most of the time, I don't know about all vets, but you can check with Rodney Habib about that. He seems to be in the trenches with respect to the kinds of natural foods. Karen Becker and Rodney Habib out of Canada are big into the whole concept of sick dogs from the types of foods they've been eating. And they've been saying that dogs are the most abused creature on the planet from the very time they start weaning. They never really eat what they're supposed to have. And as the result of this, you get all these, the same kinds of problems that we have, the dogs have. And they're all dying very early. They've got all kinds of problems. So, but if you give them natural foods, you can significantly increase their lifespan and health.
Right, and if you look at the digestive system from nose to tail, I mean, we're very similar to canines, and I think that if people were to incorporate a more heavily meat-based diet instead of shoving down as many slices of toast as they can in their diet, I think that we'd all be a lot better off as a population. We're probably the most technologically advanced in North America, yet we fall behind in almost all categories of health in general. I mean, one of the number one causes of death in men is cardiovascular disease, which in my opinion is a direct effect from the amount of refined carbs that we do have in our diet. I believe that if we had switched over to a more heavily meat-based diet and took out the amount of oats and toast and at least minimize that, I think that we would drastically change mortality rates amongst men and women in North America, which is a sad thought, really, that's what we're fighting against.
Well, yeah, but that's part of our advance as a civilized society. And I agree with you. I mean, many of us are addicted to glucose. It's like a drug,
Yeah.
And it's permeated our entire food chain in almost every way. And as the result, it's very hard to go back and eat the kinds of food we would be doing like 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer kinds of things. Don't forget, humans evolved to eat almost anything. They're omnivores.
Yeah.
That we survive because we can eat almost everything. But don't forget, glucose was always the preferred taste. It's sweet, and you'd only get it from ripe fruits or honey or something like this. But now we can process and put sugar into almost everything. So consequently, and the meats, unless you get organic meat, some of these meats are tainted with hormones and all kinds of other things too. So it's not always the purity that you're looking for, unless you can be sure that it's an organic. And people, when you talk about meat, people like tender meats, right? So
Yeah.
if you eat free range stuff, like cows or whatever, it's a lot more gamey and tough. You feed cows corn. Corn-fed cows makes the meat very tender because the massive acid indigestion in their gut when you give them corn, and then you have to use antacids to reduce the acidity. And whatever that does, it makes the meat in their body very soft and tender. This is abnormal. This is a complete aberration. You eat buffalo meat that's grazed on grass. It's a very different than buffalo that's eating corn.
Right.
But people like this soft. They say, "Oh, I can cut this meat with my fork." Well, you shouldn't be able to do that in the first place. But it's really good, and it's soft, it's tender, it's juicy. Cows than corn. So again, you got to be careful of the kinds of meats. I mean, the whole system is just modified for Western technology.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about the addiction to glucose, and you're absolutely right. I mean, for anyone that's had a chocolate bar or a piece of candy, it's really hard to deny really how good it tastes. And that's because fruit itself tastes great, and honey does as well. And now you're talking about processing that, refining it, and really squeezing as much as you can into a concentrated form. So it's a hard thing to kick, especially when you grow up as a child. And a lot of our pleasure centers are built around that. So, you win a baseball game, you go out for ice cream. It's your birthday, you get a birthday cake. When you're sad, you open up a tub of ice cream. So I think socially, we've also grown to attaching our pleasure centers around carbohydrates and simple sugars, along with the addiction that it provides. And that is, a dual form, I think, way of us really latching on to sugar and having a hard time kicking that habit. You're absolutely right. I do believe that it's an addiction similar to anything else, drugs or alcohol. Now, in terms of sugar and kind of how people threw it under the rug and started to blame meat and saturated fat, can you dive a little bit about the history? And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a time, I believe it was in the 60s, where the American Sugar Association was working with Harvard researchers in order to publish data on saturated fat that was maybe misinformed, and to promote sugar as a natural and healthy form of fuel.
Yeah, but I can't really speak to that as well as other people might be able to do, like David Ludwig and David Diamond and these kinds of guys. They're more into that, the history of this, and what happened there with respect to the shift over to a more carbohydrate-based diet. But I'm not into that. I'm into killing tumor cells without harming the rest of the body. That's what we do. Now, we can prevent cancer or we can treat cancer. The question is how you're going to do that without harming the body, and that's where we are right now.
Right. And so for someone, if you had to give a piece of advice for someone who would say they were dealing with cancer and they were looking at other forms of therapy that were a little bit more natural in conjunction with whatever they were doing, let's say it's radiation or chemotherapy, is there advice for someone who maybe before taking the leap to a full ketogenic diet, are there things that they can do to kind of help their situation and the response to therapy?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really a hard thing to say, because the whole system is geared towards toxicity when it comes to managing cancer. It's a good point. Why are we poisoning ourselves or why is some professional trying to poison a cancer patient to make them healthy? They want to stop the proliferation of cells that are out of control, but those cells can't grow if they don't have energy. So if you target their energy source, they'll die just as well as being poisoned. And I use the term poison because a lot of these chemotherapies are in fact poisons. People are trained to deliver these very toxic compounds just to kill so you don't actually. It's a fine threshold between burning the whole house down and killing a few cells. And many cancers come back because they ferment. It's not that they're tough. You don't never take away the fuels that drive their proliferation. That means that you always have the risk of them coming back. And each time they come back, the body is weaker and weaker and can no longer deal with the problem, and people die. The immunotherapies that are new, that a lot of people think are going to save them, and some people rightly are saved, but many are killed as well. So you should never really treat anybody with a therapy that has a remote possibility of actually killing you. And that's essentially what's happening in our cancer field, is that many of these therapies can actually put you at risk for death from the treatment itself. And that should never happen. I mean, this is like nuts.
Right.
But yet this is what everybody thinks is going to save them. And then they go through and find out at the end it's not working, and it's all over. But not for everybody. We have a lot of people who've survived cancer using toxic poisons and radiation. The problem, of course, is that their bodies have now been subjected to toxicity, which itself is not healthy for long-term survival. You end up with a lot of other ailments as the result of being subjected to chemo and radiation. And then that puts you at risk for all kinds of other including cardiovascular disease, neuropsychiatric problems, all kinds of things. So the whole system is just like upside down. It's a failed system. And that's the reason why we have 1,600 people in the United States dying every day from cancer. And that tells us that it's a failed system.
Yeah. I agree with that. And, I guess the last thing would be, you can't really give medical advice on cancer over a podcast, but looking at, different cancers and adjuvant therapies, is there a general piece of advice or guidance that you could give to people with cancer? I mean, should they be trying a ketogenic diet on their own? Should they be going through a doctor? I know you said people are working on clinics specifically for that, but say someone doesn't have access to a ketogenic diet clinic targeted toward cancer, and then their doctor says, oh no, this is a ridiculous fad, don't even look into it. What advice would you have for people that really think this might work for them? Yeah,
you raised a very important point. It's a tragedy that the oncology community is not aware of or understand the mechanisms by which these things work. And the other problem, of course, that's afflicted this whole entire field is the word diet. Historically in medicine, diet has always been a very ambiguous kind of thing in the first place. Nobody knows what all the components of a diet. We try to steer away from the term ketogenic diet in preference to ketogenic metabolic therapy, which is a very different situation in the sense that patients are put into therapeutic ketosis, which is ultimately what puts the pressure on the tumor cell. And then we hit them with glutamine targeting and hyperbaric oxygen, but it has to be done in a very strategic way. And the tragedy, of course, right now is that there's almost very few people in the entire planet that know anything about this or how to do it. And they're not trained to know about this. They think cancer is a genetic disease when it's not. So you're subjecting your patients to horrific toxicity in the lack of knowledge on what the biology of the disease actually is. And it will take considerable time to retrain the entire field into knowing. So in the meantime, these poor people have to go to the top hospitals and be surgically mutilated, poisoned, and irradiated to make them healthy. And that should not happen. But it happens every day only because the people that are supposed to be treating you don't know about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take take time for sure. And, luckily we have people like you that are putting their time and effort into bringing awareness to it and really, I guess you could say, dialing it in to make sure it's the most effective and efficient way of treating cancer and the most natural way. But yeah, that's all very informative. I want to thank you again for coming on to chat with us. It was great. And, just in case you want to let people know if they can connect with you or your lab, where they can find you and your university as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm at Boston College, and we also get funding from the Foundation for Metabolic Therapy, Travis Christofferson. You might want to consider speaking to him someday. He wrote the book Tripping Over the Truth, which is the emergence of the field of metabolic therapy for cancer. So because it's not easy to get funding to do things to help resolve the disease. It's to study cancer, but to resolve it, it's another thing altogether. So we continue our research. We continue working with medical groups around the world. And hopefully we'll set up the kinds of clinics in this country and abroad that will allow cancer patients to be managed without fear of being subjected to high toxic therapies. So this is the future. It has to be the future because the current path is a failed one. And I think people will benefit immensely once they come to know about all this.
Yep, that's great. Okay, thank you again, Dr. Seyfried.
Okay.
It was a pleasure chatting with you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah,
I
you
appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye now.
Thanks. Take care. Talk soon.